Hello and welcome to Salome's Writer Therapy, where you and your writing connect, where I share tips and techniques on writing, but also give you tools and clarity on how to choose the option that is right for the writer that you want to be. Now, I am so excited about today's episode. As we're heading closer to November and NaNoWriMo, I want to do a 4-week series where I'll talk about the 4 key elements of writing a story: conflict, character, plot, and setting. Now, if you've never heard of NaNoWriMo or National Novel Writing Month, it is a challenge to write 50,000 words in the month of November. I have linked their website in the description below if you want more details. It is a great way to get connected with other writers and to get your writing done. So, in today's episode, we are going to talk about conflict, what it is, how it works in stories, and most importantly, how do you create the right conflict in your story. I have also created a free download that you can find in the description below. So grab your favorite beverage and a cozy spot, and let's dive into today's episode. First, I want to talk to you about the 4 key elements and how they interact, so that you will understand why, of all these elements, I want to talk about conflict first. So, setting, character, plot, and conflict. Let's imagine for a moment that your setting of your story is a container, and within it, you have oil, that is your character, and water, that is your plot, and you have a whisk. Your plot and your character is shaped by your setting, just like the water and the oil is shaped by its container. The water and oil will look different when it is in a glass versus a large mixing bowl, right? So, in that way, your setting, your plot, and your character are connected. Without proper setting, your plot and character will fall apart. Now, if you just had setting, plot, and character, then nothing will happen, right? There's no movement. They're just sitting there. The oil and the water don't even mix. They're just there, separated in a container. Now, just with water and oil in that container, nothing happens without the whisk. There is no momentum, no driving force, no movement without conflict. And also, because the water and oil don't mix or combine, you have to add the whisk, the conflict. And you want your character and plot to be intertwined because that's what makes a great story. If you whisk the water and the oil, they mix and combine. If you remove the whisk, the oil and water will separate once again. And it is the same with plot and character. Conflict is not just the glue that binds the other elements together, but it provides the story with much needed momentum or drive. You will hear a lot of people say that conflict drives your story forward. And in this case, it's absolutely true. Just like with the whisk, nothing happens until you add the whisk. So just like with the container with the water and oil, nothing happens until you add the whisk, add that conflict. So what is conflict? Conflict at its core is anything that stands in the way of your character achieving their goals, which we'll talk about in detail in the character episode. Or it causes some kind of struggle or obstacle for your character, which is usually from either the plot or the setting. A good story has conflict that comes from all of these other key elements, from character, from plot, and from setting. Now, there are 5 different types of conflict. Now, please don't feel overwhelmed. I'm going to explain them in detail a little bit later. So first we have man versus self. Then we have man versus man versus society, man versus nature, and man versus fate. Now, as I said, I'll explain in detail in just a second. Before we move on to that, I just want to talk about how conflict should work in a story. So you can get big, obvious conflicts, like your character faces a space rocket hurtling towards the planet and is about to destroy it. That is a big and obvious conflict. Now, you also have small and seemingly inconsequential conflicts. Now, the key here is you don't want to keep it to inconsequential conflict. So, an example of one of these small and seemingly inconsequential conflicts might be that your character is about to leave her house to visit her family, and as she walks through the living room, her phone rings. Now, the ringing phone is that small and seemingly inconsequential conflict. Now, you can leave it at that. The person on the other end of the phone might be a friend who just wanted to talk and nothing really happens. Now, that's not really good conflict to add in the story, right? It's just filler. But what if, on the other end of the line, you have a police officer who tells your character that there has been an accident and someone in her family has been hurt? Now, immediately, that seemingly inconsequential conflict of the ringing phone, which kept the character from achieving her goal of leaving the house to visit her family, became meaningful to that character. And you build on it by adding elements to make it meaningful to your character. The more meaningful the conflict to your character, the better the conflict is. So here we get to the meat of the episode of how do you choose the right conflict in your story, especially at the beginning when you're just starting out and you might not even have figured out your character, your plot, or your setting, or any details about it. Why would I want you to start with a conflict? The reason for that is if you have your conflict figured out, or at least a good amount of it, then that will help you to build your character, your plot, and your setting in a way that links with the conflict. And you won't have to struggle to add conflict or movement to your story in a meaningful way because you already have it figured out, or at least a good amount of it, right? So let's go back to those 5 types of conflict. Now, I've changed the wording in them so that they apply more to the story world. So instead of man versus self, I will call it character versus self. So, in terms of character versus self conflict, that is what we usually call internal conflict. That is the conflict that arises between the character and their inner self. Now, the way that you create that kind of conflict is to create that obstacle, to create that struggle. You create that thing that stands in the way of your character from achieving their goal. And I've got a couple of examples of things that you can consider when you think about character versus self conflict. You can think about your character might have trust issues, or struggles with abandonment, or is greedy, or they always put duty above themselves, or honor is the thing that they would live and die for. Things like that could create conflict in your story. Now, the next type of conflict, which was the man versus man, and for our example, I'm going to say character versus character. The way that you can create this kind of conflict in your story is to look at how the two characters would interact with each other and think about creating clashing personalities, or include betrayals or feelings of mistrust, or something that happened in their past or in their upbringing that might cause that struggle or the obstacle, or something that will stand in your character's way. The next type of conflict is the character versus society. This one, the way to create that kind of conflict is to look at things like social standing, religious views, cultural differences. Think of how your character would interact with their own society, as well as with societies outside of their own that you've created in their world. And if you haven't created anything of your setting just yet, that's fine. But just think about how can you tap into social standing, religions, cultures, things like that, to provide that struggle and that obstacle for your character. The next one is character versus nature. How you create this kind of conflict is you look at things like the climate, the terrain. You can add natural disasters like volcanoes and hurricanes, or you can look at fauna and flora and think of how you can create things or events that would create that obstacle for your character or provide that struggle or keep them from reaching their goal. It's fine if you don't know what the goal is yet. We will get to that when we get to the character episode. But just think of things, even if you make a list of 50 different things that might happen, as long as you have some kind of an idea of what kind of conflict you want to create for your character. Now, the last type of conflict is the character versus fate. I would say that this one is the one that people focus on the most. And when I say fate in this regard, I almost think of it as the author's hand. That this type of conflict should actually say character versus plot, because you, as the author, will create events and choices and things for your character that will create conflict almost naturally, right? But if you think of the character versus fate conflict, then the way to create that is to look at the choices that the characters in your story will make, or the events that you are going to add into your story, whether it's good or bad. Now, obviously, those events can link to other kinds of conflict. So you might create an event that is actually a character versus nature or character versus society kind of conflict, but because it is linked with the plot, it will also create a character versus fate conflict because you are at the hand of that conflict, if that makes sense. You, as the author, are in control. And sometimes this one seems easier than it is, because with this kind of conflict, you have to remember that you don't want to show the author's hand. So it has to be in a way that feels natural and believable for the world and the characters that you've created. So the character should make choices that align with who they are. And by their choices, it will create that conflict. So think about how you can manipulate your character in a way. I say manipulate, I don't mean it in a bad way, because we haven't built our characters yet, right? We're still just focusing on conflict. So think about how you would be able to manipulate your character to fit in with the choices that you need them to make in order to get them to the point of the conflict that you need them to be. You have to be able to drive your character to those choices in a believable way so that those events can occur, so that your vision as the author can come to light. So that is why I say these things are interconnected. You can't think of one without doing the other. And that's why I wanted to start with conflict, because that is the one thing that every other key element has a part of. And as I've said before, it moves the story forward. It is that driving force of the story. Without conflict, nothing happens. So even without having a complete picture of your character, your plot, or your setting, you can already build a framework of conflict within which you can build those elements. It will make it much easier to create a character if you know what conflicts you need them to face. It will be so much easier to build a plot if you know what conflict you want to include. The same with your setting. If you know that you want to create a conflict with regards to the climate of your world because you think that will be a good conflict, then you know you have to create a world or a setting that will accommodate that. And so that will make it easier for you to build those other elements, your character, your plot, and your setting. And remember, I'm going to say it again because it's worth remembering. Conflict is the glue that holds your character, your plot, and your setting together. It is the driving force of your story. Without conflict, your story will not go anywhere. Just like with the whisk and the water and the oil, they will not mix, they will not move until you add the whisk. You have to have conflict for your story to move anywhere. Now, I will be going into detail on each of the other elements in the next few weeks. I'm going to talk about character, I'm going to talk about plot, and I'm going to talk about setting. Not just what they are, but how can you create them and build them to make a story that not only you love, but that your readers won't be able to put down. So make sure that you are subscribed and getting notifications so you don't miss those episodes. So that's it for today's episode. If you have a question, don't hesitate to leave it in a comment below. And as always, check out that free resource in the description to help you determine the conflict that you want to add to your story. So until next time, may your creativity flow freely and your fingers dance upon the keys, and keep writing with joy and stay connected. Cheers.